Good morning, boys and girls. Today is Friday, March 20th, 2020. It's the first day of spring. So I thought I would start videoing myself reading a book to you each day over this break. I hope that you enjoy it and that you will send me comments. Also, I'd like to know if you have any questions regarding the work that I sent home for you to do over the break. So this is week 28. You could be taking your Friday quiz today. I hope that you've been on the district website and gone to Connect Ed and Studies Weekly. Even doing Typing Agent would be a great activity for you to do for 20 or 30 minutes a day. Anyway, let's stay in touch. And now I'm going to read one of my favorite books from when I was a child, The Little House in the Big Woods. This is a historical fiction book. Laura Ingalls, the author, was a real person, but some of what she wrote was didn't actually happen to her at the exact time. So I'll show you some of the pictures. Here she is in her house. And this is to remind us that, a while ago, people didn't have some of the nice things that we have today. She lived in a little log cabin with her mom and dad and sister in the woods of Wisconsin. So chapter 1, Little House in the Big Woods. Once upon a time, 60 years ago, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin in a little gray house made of logs. The great dark trees of the big woods stood all around the house, and beyond them were other trees, and beyond them were more trees, as far as a man could go to the north in a day, or a week, or a whole month. There was nothing but woods. There were no houses, there were no roads, there were no people. There were only trees and wild animals who had their homes among them. Wolves lived in the big woods, and bears and huge wild cats. Muskrats and mink and otter lived by the stream. Foxes had dens in the hills, and deer roamed everywhere. To the east of the little log house and to the west, there were miles upon miles of trees, and only a few little log houses scattered far apart in the edge of the big woods. So far as a little girl could see, there was only the one little house where she lived with her father and mother, her sister Mary, and baby sister Carrie. A wagon track ran before the house, turning and twisting out of sight in the woods where the wild animals lived. But the little girl did not know where it went, nor what might be at the end of it. The little girl was named Laura, and she called her father Pa and her mother Ma. In those days, in that place, children did not say father and mother, nor mama and papa, as they do now. At night, when Laura lay awake in the trundle bed, she listened and could not hear anything at all but the sound of the trees whispering together. Sometimes far away at night, a wolf howled. Then he came nearer and howled again. It was a scary sound. Laura knew that wolves would eat little girls, but she was safe inside the solid log walls. Her father's gun hung above the door, and good old Jack, the brindle bulldog, lay on guard before it. Her father would say, "Go to sleep, Laura. Jack won't let the wolves in." So Laura snuggled under the covers of the trundle bed, close beside Mary, and went to sleep. One night, her father picked her up out of bed and carried her to the window so that she might see the wolves. There were two of them sitting in front of the house. They looked like shaggy dogs. They pointed their nose into the bright moon and howled. Jack paced up and down before the door, growling. The hair stood up on his back, and he showed his sharp, fierce teeth to the wolves. They howled, but they could not get in. The house was a comfortable house. Upstairs, there was a large attic, pleasant to play in when the rain drummed on the roof. Downstairs was a small bedroom and the big room. The bedroom had a window that closed with a wooden shutter. The big room had two windows with glass in the panes and had two doors, a front door, and a back door. All around the house was a crooked rail fence to keep the bears and the deer away. In the yard in front of the house were 2 beautiful big oak trees. Every morning, as soon as she was awake, Laura ran to look out the window, and one morning she saw in each of the big trees a dead deer hanging from a branch. Pa had shot the deer the day before, and Laura had been asleep when she brought them home at night and hung them high in the tree so the wolves could not get the meat. That day, Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary had fresh venison for dinner. It was so good that Laura wished they could eat it all, but most of the meat must be salted and smoked and packed away to be eaten during the winter. For winter was coming. The days were shorter and the frost crawled up the window panes at night. Soon the snow would come, and then the log house would be almost buried in snowdrifts, and the lake and the streams would freeze. In the bitter cold winter, Pa could not be sure of finding any wild game to shoot for meat. The bears would be hidden away in their dens, which they slept soundly all winter long. The squirrels would be curled in their nests in the hollows of trees, and with their furry tails wrapped snugly around their noses. The deer and the rabbit would be shy and swift. Even if Pa could get a deer, it would be poor and thin, not fat and plump like the deer that are in the fall. Pa might hunt alone all day in the bitter cold in the big woods covered with snow, and come home at night with nothing for Ma and Mary and Laura to eat. So as much food as possible must be stored away in the little house before the winter came. Pa skinned the deer carefully and salted and stretched the hides, for he would make soft leather of them. Then he cut up the meat and sprinkled salt over the pieces that laid them on the board. Standing at the end of the yard in the tall length cut from a trunk of a big hollow tree, Pa had driven nails inside as far as he could reach from each end. Then he stood it up, put a little roof over the top, and cut a little door on one side near the bottom. On the piece that he cut out, he fastened leather hinges, and he fitted it into a place that was like a little door with the bark still on it. After the deer meat had been salted several days, Dad cut a hole near the end of each piece and put a string on it. Laura watched him do this, and she watched him hang the meat on the nails in the hollow log. He reached up through the little door and hung the meat on the nails as far as he could reach. Then he put a ladder through the log, climbed up to the top, moved the roof to one side, and reached down inside to hang meat on those nails. Then Pa put the roof back on, climbed down the ladder, and said to Laura, "Run over to the chopping block and fetch me some of those green hickory chips, new, clean, white ones." So Laura ran to the block where Father chopped wood and filled her apron with fresh, sweet-smelling wood chips. Just inside the little door in the hollow log, Pa built a fire of tiny bits of bark and moss, and he laid some of the chips on it carefully. Instead of burning quickly, the green chips smoldered and filled the hollow log with a thick, choking smoke. Pa shut the door, and the little smoke squeezed through the crack around it, and little smoke came out through the roof, but most of it was shut inside with the meat. There was nothing better than good hickory smoke, Pa said, and that made good venison, and that will keep anywhere in any weather. Then he took his gun and slung his axe on his shoulder, and he went away to the clearing to cut down some more trees. Laura and Ma watched the fire for several days. When smoke stopped coming through the cracks, Laura would bring more hickory chips, and Ma would put them on the fire under the meat. Here are some pictures of the smoker and Laura filling her apron with the wood chips and bringing them to Pa. All the time, there was a little smell of smoke in the yard. At last, Pa said the venison had smoked long enough. Then they let the fire go out, and Pa took the strips and the pieces of meat out. Pa wrapped each piece neatly in paper and hung them in the attic where they would be keep safe and dry. One morning when Pa went away before dawn with the horses and the wagon, and that night he came home with a wagon load of fish. The big wagon box was piled full, and some of the fish were as big as Laura. Pa had gone to Lake Pepin and caught them all with a net. Ma cut large slices of flaky white fish without one bone for Laura and Mary. They all feasted on the good fresh fish. All they did not eat fresh was salted down in barrels for the winter. Pa owned a pig. It ran wild in the big woods, living on acorns and nuts and roots, and now he caught it, put it in the pen made of logs to fatten. He would butcher it as soon as the weather was cold enough to keep the pork frozen. Once in the middle of the night, Laura woke up and she heard the pig squealing. Pa jumped out of bed, snatched his gun from the wall, and ran out. Laura heard the gun go off once, twice. When Pa came back, he told her what had happened. He had seen a big bear standing beside the pig pen. The bear was reaching in the pen to grab the pig, and the pig was running and squealing. Pa saw this in the starlight, and he fired quickly. But the light was dim, and in his haste, he missed the bear. The bear ran away into the woods, not hurt at all. Laura was sorry. Pa did not get the bear. She liked bear meat so much. Pa was sorry too, but he said, "Anyway, I saved the bacon." The garden behind the little house had been growing all summer, and it was near the house that the deer did not jump the fence to eat the vegetables in the daytime, and at night Jack kept them away. Sometimes in the morning there were little hoof prints around the carrots and the cabbages, but Jack's tracks were there too, and the deer had jumped right out again. Now the potatoes and carrots and beets, turnips and cabbages were gathered and stored in the cellar, for freezing nights had come. Onions were made into long ropes braided together by their tops, and then were hung in the attic beside the wreaths of red peppers strung on the threads. The pumpkins and squash were piled in orange and yellow and green heaps in the attic's corner. The barrels of salted fish were in the pantry, and yellow cheeses were stacked on the pantry shelves. Then one day Uncle Henry came riding up out of the big woods, and he came to help Pa butcher. Ma's big butcher knife was ready and sharpened, and Uncle Henry had brought Aunt Polly's butcher knife. Near the pig pen, Pa and Uncle Henry built a bonfire and heated a great kettle of water over it. When the water was boiling, they went to kill the hog. Then Laura ran and hid her head in the bed and stopped her ears with her fingers so she couldn't hear the hog squeal. "It doesn't hurt him, Laura," Pa said. "We do it so quickly." But she did not want to hear him squeal. In a minute, she took one finger out cautiously and listened. The hog had stopped squealing. After that, butchering time was great fun. And it was such a busy day, and there was so much to see. As soon as the hog was dead, Pa and Uncle Henry lifted it up and down in the boiling water till it was well scalded. Then they laid it on a board and they scraped it with their knives. All of the bristles came off. After that, they hung the hog in the tree, took out the insides and left it hanging cool. When it was cool, they took it down and they cut it. There was ham, shoulders, side meat, spare ribs, and belly. There was all the other pieces too. The dish pan full of bits to be made into sausage. The meat was laid on the board in the back door shed. Every piece was sprinkled with salt. The ham and the shoulders were put to pickle in brine, for they would be smoked like the venison in the hollow log. They couldn't beat hickory cured ham, Pa said. He was blowing up the bladder, and it made a little white balloon, and he tied it with a string and gave it to Mary and Laura to play with. They could throw it into the air and pass it back and forth with their hands, or it could bounce along the ground and they could kick it. But even better fun than a balloon was the pig's tail. Here's a picture of Mary and Laura playing with the bladder from the pig that their father blew up for them and tied with a string. In front of the cook stove raked hot coals and out on the hearth. Then Mary and Laura took turns holding the pig's tail over the coals. It sizzled and fried, and the drops of fat dripped off, and it blazed in the coals. Ma sprinkled it with salt. Their hands and faces got very hot, and Laura burned her fingers. But she was so excited she didn't care. Roasting the pig's tail was such fun, and it was hard to play fair, taking turns. At last it was done. It was nicely browned and all over, and it smelled so good. They carried it out to the yard to cool, and even before it was cool enough, they began tasting it and burning their tongues. They ate every little bit of the meat off the bone, and then they gave the bones to Jack. And that was the end of the pig's tail. They would not be another one until next year. Uncle Henry went home after dinner, and Pa went away to his work in the big woods. But for Laura and Mary and Ma, butchering time had only begun. There was a great deal for Ma to do, and Laura and Mary helped her. All that day and the next day, Ma was trying out the lard in big iron pots. Laura and Mary carried wood and watched the fire. It must be hot, but not too hot, or the lard would burn. The big pots simmered and boiled, and they must not smoke. From time to time, Mary's Ma skimmed off the brown cracklings. She put them in a cloth and squeezed every bit of the lard, and then she put the cracklings away. She would use those to make pancakes later. Cracklings were very good to eat, but Laura and Mary could have only a taste. They were too rich for little girls, Ma said. She scraped and cleaned the head carefully, and then she boiled it till all the meat fell off the bones. She chopped the meat fine in her chopping knife. She seasoned it with pepper and salt and spices. Then she mixed the pot liquid with it, and she set it aside in a pan to cool. When it was cool, she would cut it into slices, and then they would have head cheese. The little pieces of meat, lean and fat, that had been cut off the large pieces, Ma chopped and chopped until they were all chopped fine. She seasoned it with salt and pepper and dried sage, and with her hands she tossed and turned it and mixed it into balls. She put the balls in a pan out in the shed where they would freeze to be good to eat all winter. That was the sausage. Then, when butchering time was all over, there were sausages and head cheese, big jars of lard, a keg of white salt pork out in the shed, and in the attic hung smoked hams and shoulders. The little house was fairly bustling with good food stored away for all the long winter. The pantry and shed and the cellar were full. So was the attic. Laura and Mary must play in the house now, for it was cold outdoors. Brown leaves were all falling from the tree. The fire in the cook stove never went out. And here are Mary and Laura playing in the attic where all the food was stored with their little dolls. See the pumpkins and the onions hanging? At night, Pa banked it with ashes to keep the coals alive till morning. The attic was a lovely place to play. The large, round, colored pumpkins made beautiful chairs and tables. The little red peppers and onions dangled overhead. The ham and the venison hung in the paper wrappings, and all the bunches of dried herbs and spices for cooking and the bitter herbs for medicine gave the place a dusty, spicy smell. Often the wind howled outside with a cold and lonesome sound. But it was the attic. Laura and Mary played house with the squashes and the pumpkins, and everything was snug and cozy. Mary was bigger than Laura, and she had a rag doll named Nettie. Laura had only a corn cob wrapped in a handkerchief, but it was a good doll, and she named it Susan. It wasn't Susan's fault that she was only a corn cob. Sometimes Mary let Laura hold Nettie, but she did it only when Susan couldn't see. The best times were all at night. After supper, Pa brought in the traps from the shed to grease them by the fire. He rubbed them bright and greased the hinges and the jaws and the springs of the pans with a feather dipped in bear's grease. There were small traps and medium-sized traps. And here's a picture of Pa and Mary. And the great bear traps, and the teeth in their jaws that Pa said would break a man's leg if they shut on it. While he greased the traps, Pa told Laura and Mary little jokes and stories, and afterwards he would play his fiddle. The door and the windows were tightly shut, and the cracks of the windows frames stuffed with cloth to keep it cold. But Black Susan, the cat, came and went as she pleased day and night through a little swinging door of a cat hole at the bottom. She always went very quickly, so the door would not catch on her tail when it fell shut behind her. One night when Pa was greasing the trap, he watched Black Susan come in, and he said, "There was a little man who had 2 cats, a big cat and a little cat." Laura and Mary ran to lean on his knees and hear the rest. "He had 2 cats," Pa repeated, "a big cat and a little cat. So he made a big cat hole door and for the big cat, and then he made a little cat hole door for the little cat." There Pa stopped. "But why couldn't the little cat?" Mary began. "Because the big cat wouldn't let it in," Laura interrupted. "Laura, that is very rude. You must never interrupt," said Pa. "But I see," he said, "that either one of you has more sense than the man who cut the 2 cat holes in his door. When he laid away the traps, he took his fiddle out of the box and he began to play, and that was the best time of all." So this makes me think of now. Many of us have stored food away because we can't go to the store as often as we used to. And we also have only the toys that we have here. But I also hope that you're getting outside and playing in this beautiful fresh air on this first day of spring. So let me know how you like the story and if you have any other questions. And I will see you again soon.